The Martian is about an astronaut, played by Matt Damon, who survives being stranded on Mars by farming potatoes in Martian dirt, fertilized with feces. Pretty fun, no? Well, new lab experiments suggest that growing food on the red planet will be a lot more complicated than simply planting crops with poop. So how complicated is it going to be? Let's dive in. Firstly, what did the Martian get wrong about living on Mars? Quite a bit, actually. It's not surprising that a film got a few things wrong about the hard science, but The Martian made some pretty big errors when it came to the feasibility of farming on Mars. Though it's a great film and nothing short of entertaining from start to finish, it's not exactly the top of the food chain in terms of accuracy. Pretty far down, in fact. First of all, the soil on Mars is not particularly conducive to growing crops. It's mostly composed of crushed rock and lacking in the organic matter that helps plants grow on Earth. This means that astronauts would need to add nutrients and remove toxic chemicals from the soil before they could even think about planting anything. As much as we may want to, simply using feces to fertilize the soil is not going to cut it. Human waste is full of pathogens that could potentially contaminate the food supply, and it would be a pretty big health risk for the astronauts. Funny? Yes. Feasible? Not really. Secondly, the atmosphere on Mars is much thinner than Earth's, and it doesn't have much in the way of protection from the sun's harmful ultraviolet radiation. This means that any plants that were grown on the surface would need to be protected from the elements, probably inside some kind of greenhouse. And finally, Mars does not have the same 24-hour day/night cycle that we do on Earth. The planet's day is actually only about 40 minutes longer than its night. This would mean that plants would need to be adapted to grow in this strange light cycle, or else they would likely die. So, while The Martian was a fun film, it's probably not the best guide for actually living on Mars. Sorry, Matt Damon, you just can't grow food as easily as you grew potatoes. So, what did The Martian get right about life on Mars? Well, The Martian isn't exactly wrong that we could hypothetically grow crops on Mars. It's just that it's going to be a lot harder than the film makes it seem. In order to make farming on Mars possible, we would need to develop some pretty sophisticated technology. This would include things like artificial lighting and temperature control to mimic the conditions on Earth that plants are used to. Scientists have actually been figuring out exactly what we'll need to do, and we'll dive into that in a minute. Before that, though, it's worth mentioning that The Martian was wrong about dust storms, only partially. Although there will definitely be dust storms on the surface of Mars, it's clear that these storms will not be the apocalyptic event that they are in the film. In reality, they will be more like bad dust storms on Earth, and they will not be large enough to completely cover the planet. In fact, due to the atmosphere on Mars, it's likely that the dust storms will not be as common or intense as they are in The Martian. It'll seem like a light breeze and be even more subtle than those on Earth. If we're talking about things they got right, though, the overbearing coldness of Mars is definitely accurate. Without a strong atmosphere, the planet is incredibly cold, and this would be a major obstacle to farming on the surface. But how do we make farming on Mars possible? In order to make farming on Mars possible, we're going to need to develop some pretty advanced technology. This includes things like artificial lighting and temperature control to mimic the conditions on Earth that plants are used to. Luckily, scientists on Earth, actual ones, not film directors, are coming up with ways to make this happen. Researchers recently planted lettuce and the weed Arabidopsis thaliana in 3 kinds of fake Mars dirt to see if they could grow. 2 of the soils were made from materials mined in Hawaii or the Mojave Desert that look like Mars dirt. To make the third, they used volcanic rock, clays, salts, and other ingredients that NASA's Curiosity rover has seen on Mars. While both lettuce and A. thaliana survived in the Mars-like natural soils, neither could grow in the synthetic dirt. This suggests that we're going to need to add nutrients and remove toxic chemicals from the soil before we can even think about planting anything. The good news is that But with enough time and research, we will probably be able to figure out how to make farming on Mars possible. It's just going to be a lot harder than The Martian makes it seem. And now, what's the difference between soil on the Earth and on Mars? There's a big difference between the soil on Earth and the soil on Mars. Soil on Earth is full of microbes and other organic matter that helps plants grow. But Mars dirt is basically crushed rock. This means that astronauts would need to add nutrients and remove toxic chemicals from the soil before they could even think about planting anything. Basically, you can think of Martian soil as being similar to sand. It's not particularly conducive to plant growth and would need to be heavily amended before anything could grow in it. And it's even worse due to the chemicals and toxins that are present on the Martian surface. They would need to be removed before planting, or they would potentially contaminate the food supply. And what role can hydroponics play in farming on Mars? Hydroponics is a method of growing plants without soil, using only water and nutrients. This could be a potential way to get around the problems with Martian soil, but it would come with its own challenges. For one thing, hydroponics requires a lot of water, and water is a scarce resource on Mars. There is some ice on the planet's surface, but it would need to be melted and purified before it could be used for plants. Another problem is that hydroponically grown plants tend to be smaller and less nutritious than those grown in soil. This means that astronauts would likely need to supplement their diet with other foods, such as freeze-dried or canned goods. So while hydroponics could potentially be used to grow crops on Mars, it's not a perfect solution. So what are the challenges of growing plants in Mars's thin atmosphere? The atmosphere on Mars is much thinner than Earth's, and it doesn't have much in the way of protection from the sun's harmful ultraviolet radiation. This means that any plants that were grown on the surface would need to be protected from the elements, probably inside some kind of greenhouse. Greenhouses are not exactly a new technology, but they would need to be designed specifically for the Martian environment. They would need to be airtight to keep the Martian atmosphere out, and they would need to filter the UV radiation. It's also worth noting that Mars has a much higher concentration of carbon dioxide in its atmosphere than Earth does. This could potentially be used to help plants grow, but it would also need to be carefully regulated. Finally, what about the calcium perchlorate in Martian soil? Calcium perchlorate is a toxic salt that makes up to about 2% of the Martian surface. When scientists added it to their synthetic dirt, neither lettuce nor Arabidopsis thaliana, a weed, grew at all. This is a major problem for Martian farming, but there may be a way around it. There are bacteria on Earth that enjoy perchlorates as food, and they give off oxygen as they eat it. If these bacteria were taken from Earth to Mars to munch on perchlorates in Martian dirt, they could not only get rid of a toxic component of the dirt, but they might also help produce breathable oxygen for astronauts. So, while calcium perchlorate is a major obstacle to farming on Mars, it's not necessarily a showstopper. With enough time and research, we will probably be able to figure out a way around it. So, there you have it. Farming on Mars is going to be a lot harder than The Martian makes it seem, but it's not impossible. With enough time and research, we will probably be able to figure out a way to make it work. Of course, there are still many challenges that need to be overcome, and we'll probably have quite a few years of development to go before we reach a stage where we can truly be confident that our Martian farms aren't going to result in disaster. Still, this is a step in the right journey. Though The Martian may not be accurate, scientists here on Earth are continuing to find ways that would make growing food on Mars possible, even if in a laboratory. Now, it's really just time to wait and see what they come up with next. But what do you think? Do you see growing food on Mars as the next logical step, or is it simply too impractical? Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below. Thanks for watching, and remember to subscribe so you don't miss out on future content.